Katie Shide's UTMB. We didn't talk about that on our last one, I don't think, did we? It was
No, we did
before
not. I
that.
think it was like it was right before that, which is, yeah, definitely something worth talking about for sure.
Yeah, it seemed to me that was like a performance that was I mean, Katie Schide this year, I think, is like when her performance at Western States was obviously close enough to Courtney's time and then breaking the course record at UTMB. It felt to me like the sport took a step towards where I think the men's side of the field has been at for a bit now, where if those two are on the starting line of the same race, it's no longer, well, it's Courtney's race to lose, or you can't necessarily have the kind of like the Tiger Woods effect of golf where it was Tiger versus the field for such a long time. It was like kind of Courtney versus the field where like you either bet on Courtney or everybody else, and that would be kind of how that would play. Now it's like, it's almost, in my opinion, I would probably feel compelled to look at what they had been doing prior. And if it was something where one of them was peaking for, or the way I like to look at this is like if one peaks for Western and the other peaks for UTMB, I'm
Mm.
betting on the peaking, not the person any longer. And I think that's maybe the first time I'd be willing to say that for someone other than Courtney.
100%. Yeah. And you make a lot of good points there. Like, I think, yeah, like she has had the Tiger Woods effect where it's like, she's a clear bet in every scenario. But now people are asking the question. They're like, can we compare Katie to Courtney? Like, how would she compare, like, in a race, like, into there too? So, that would be a cool showdown to see too. It's very interesting. Like, I think Coop put out a post because she's obviously coached by Jason Coop. Coop put out a post on like all like the things that she did differently in training, like leading up to it too. And I remember there was like a lot of really cool kind of things in there. Like they were like talking about having her do like more higher running volume because she was doing like a lot of cross training, but they got her to like run a lot
Mhm.
more, which is cool. They looked a lot more at like her nutrition, like holistic side of things, like protein consumption and just overall just getting that dialed in a lot more targeted strength training, which is really cool because I saw that and it's like, okay, like Katie made this like she's just been progressing year after year, and to see her like go this next step up, right? In the world of, if you remember our first ultra updates, we talked about like the developments in the sport with like
Yeah.
super shoes and high carb, like none of that was really mentioned in there. It was all like just doubling down on like the basics, right? It's like solid running training, getting in better nutrition holistically, like, and both also too, like, outside of the running, strength training, right? Like all things like that we know that are really important for runners. But it seemed like she just like had like a much more intentional thing according to Coop's post, and to see her like, start to edge the point where she's like meeting Courtney. It's like a cool thing, I think, for athletes to look at, because we're always looking at some of the things that I think professional athletes at a level like that, to like the average person, is not going to move the needle because they're very much like 1 or 2% things. But it's really cool to see like Katie taking like the big, like, movers of the needle that can happen to any athlete and just doubling down on those and then getting to where she's at. I thought that was just such a fascinating thing too. But I do agree. Like, I think if Katie and Courtney go toe to toe, I don't think it's a dead win conversation anymore for Courtney. I mean, I still think like she's got a chance, but Katie just seems to just get better and better and showing no signs of stopping along the way, which is, I think, such an exciting thing for the sport.
Yeah, and I think the other interesting thing about her too is, especially with the Western States performance this year,
Mm-hmm.
was it started showcasing kind of like at this point now, you kind of have to look at the athlete's history a little bit more specifically too. There's
Mm-hmm.
always going to be kind of the important things that are going to apply to almost everybody, but with Katie specifically, it's like she's a little more kind of grew up, or not maybe grew up, but she's spent a lot more times over the last few years, like
Mm-hmm.
kind of doing more UTMB style, kind of a lifestyle where, like you mentioned, a lot of cross training, a lot of like more steep mountain type stuff,
Mm-hmm.
whereas Western States is got a lot of running to it. So I think like, yeah, when you're looking at taking her from what was a world class performance the year prior to a whole nother step forward and getting into the 15s this year, you're looking at, like, probably getting a little more specific to that course, which is just gonna be more running for her, getting used to that, and it seems like it worked. And then when you're gonna try to double the way she did at Western and UTMB, I think it's a unique scenario for her too, because since she's got a background on that course, she can probably lean on those strengths a little bit more specifically, whereas for
Mm-hmm.
Western State, she kinda has to carve out a new adaptation process towards those specifics, but she can kind of turn it around maybe with proper recovery after Western States and not feel like she's got, a full like calendar buildup need to prepare for UTMB, which is maybe why we saw her break that course record after her next level Western States performance.
Right, 100%. And that's a good point of like her having that mountain background too. And one thing I'm curious, I'd love to hear your take on this too, is because being in that environment, being in the mountains and stuff, does that, even though it's not like as specific to Western States, right? Because Western States is that California carpet, very runnable kind of stuff, right? And UTMB is like steep, alpine. Of course, you get a little bit of the alpine stuff early on in Western States, but for the majority of that part where you need to close, it's very, very runnable stuff. I think about 2 years ago, and even last year too, arguably, like when you look at Javelina 100, right? It's a very runnable course. And then you got guys like Dakota Jones there, who's, he's top of the podium at Hard Rock, very, very mountainous guy. He comes out and just blasts Pat Reagan's course record that had stood for time. And this was a guy who was like, he's a mountain runner, right? And even last
Mhm.
year, looking at John Ray, like on that side of things. And so I think like, I'm curious to hear your take on this. Is Katie's, such close proximity to the mountains in France, living in that area, do you think that leads to like her just being a stronger on that runnable kind of stuff as well? Like how do you feel like that stuff translates? I'm super curious.
Yeah, I think the argument there for her would be since she's historically done more kind of cross training, mountain style training type stuff, the volume that she's probably put
Mm,
in, like holistically outside of just running, is probably quite high. So then what it becomes is like, how do we match that massive cardiovascular development with the skeletal muscle side of being able to
mm,
run for as long as you're going to have to do, and the downhill runnable stuff on Western states, which can chew your quads up, and then dealing with the heat. So for me, which I think is really a shorter window improvement need there. I think like if you're
mm,
cardiovascularly fit and then all you have to really do is get your legs ready for the specifics on a
mm,
course like Western States, that's going to be a much shorter timeline. You
mm,
can do that in like a peaking phase. Whereas if it's the other way around, if you're just like, okay, I've been a runner historically, my overall volume has been lower because I haven't been doing cycling, skiing, and things to supplement it to get those higher volume training weeks, then you may have a longer term development phase because you have to actually expose yourself to that cardiovascular side of the development for a little bit longer than you
mm,
would have to. So maybe, I mean, it seems goofy to kind of say like, oh, well, maybe Jim needed to be out in, because that'd be like kind of the men's version of that, like Jim winning Western States and then trying to
mm,
go out and win UTMB. It's kind of like the reverse scenario in that regard, where his background is running. Not a lot of cross training outside of maybe some cycling and hiking,
yeah.
but really running, a running purist for the most part for most of his development. And then he had to kind of learn the long, slow mountain hiking side of things a little bit more specifically, and then maybe weave in some cross training so he's able to ratchet that up a little bit without taking the punishment that your body's going to take from trying to run you around at that level of volume. So, yeah, I think I guess the question you're probably asking is it easier to have a background with
Mm,
kind of UTMB style lifestyle and then come over and peak for Western States, or is it easier to have a background that would lean you towards Western States and then fine tune your UTMB? I think it's gonna be easier to go UTMB to Western states. Uh,
mm-hmm,
I think 'cause we're talking about long enough distances here where all these people likely are likely fast enough where that's not gonna be a variable, that it's gonna be a variable, it's gonna give you opportunities to make more mistakes potentially, but
mm-hmm,
it's not gonna be an end all be all the way it would maybe be if you were talking about, like, a runnable course that's shorter, like Olympic distance where, if you don't have the speed
mm.
reserve, you're just not gonna get to the times that we'd be looking at from a world-class level standpoint, and then the skill set becomes something where you could work on and improve upon, but the actual high end of what you're capable of genetically and background wise is going to be a bigger factor.
Yeah, 100%. And as you're kind of talking to that too, like I agree. I think UTMB to Western is probably going to be the biggest one. I think about it almost like the repeated bout effect for like downhill running, right? It's like you look at that, you really only need, like studies show, like a couple, maybe two, three hard downhill sessions to get a pretty significant adaptation, right? And you think
Mhm.
about like what that body's going to do, at a race. Like I always say, like anytime I race like Javelina versus like a mountainous race, like I'm always way more sore after Javelina. Like it's just that running is just a little bit more harder on your body. And I think about that, it's like you have that short window where it's like maybe it's a similar thing like the repeated bout effect where you just, really condense maybe just a few weeks of just running training on top of all the cardiovascular stuff that you built on top of that. I think it's a way easier transition to go from like, being that purest runner to then like trying to cram in, because I think even historically, like looking at people who have maybe trained or had like these running backgrounds and they kind of almost go a little bit of a cram into UTMB or like just try to like just up their vert. It seems like that's always a little bit harder of a transition for some athletes that I've seen out there too. So yeah, it's a pretty interesting thing too. And, to see that like kind of play out and like some of these like really great UTMB athletes just doing well, coming into Western states or UTMB like peaking training, like that's a cool thing that I would definitely like to be curious on in terms of like what are these athletes like peaking for and everything like that too. And it'd be cool to see Katie go for the triple too, like the Western
Yeah.
hard rock, and compare the times. I think that would be a really cool thing I'd love to see over the next few years as like a wish list in the sport.
Yeah, you'd almost have to compare times, although you'd get the arguments about weather and course variance and
Right.
things like that with those type of comparisons. But it'd be kind of like the Grand Slam, right?
Yeah.
I think the days are over. I don't think what Courtney did with those 3 wins will be done again.
Mm.
I think where we're at now is it's almost impossible for the men's side of the sport to do a Western States UTMB win. I think that's unlikely. I'm never gonna say impossible, but I think that's very, very unlikely. I don't think I would never come close to betting on that happening. In fact, I would actively bet against it. If someone wins Western States on the men's side and they're doing UTMB, I'm gonna bet against them all day long for that
Mm.
scenario. Whereas kind of like I was saying before, that wouldn't have been the case had it been Courtney in the past or maybe Katie. Now I think that the women are getting much closer to that, where that sort of scenario is probably gonna be off the table. It's just gonna take maybe 1 or 2 more people like Katie and Courtney to make it such that someone is always gonna be doing one or the other, and then it kinda becomes like then you're just hoping for someone to make a mistake versus you having your best day. Uh, and you throw another race in the middle of that with Hard Rock, now all of a sudden it's just getting more and more complicated to because now you have 3 events you have to hope everyone else is avoiding. And is there a scenario where the top women in the sport, only one of them does all 3 of those, whereas one of them does all 3, but the other kinda spread out amongst them? I think that's getting rare.
Yeah, 100%. It'll be interesting to see if Jim next year goes back to redo the double because I know this year he had like some bodily issues, according to like what I was hearing too, and it was like an injury kind of thing too. But I, it's interesting. Do you think if there was someone to do in the men's, do you think it's Jim or like do you think it's still just so far out of reach?
Yeah. Oh, man, it's such a tough thing. I mean, I think it'd have to be Jim or Killian. I think you could maybe make an argument for Tom Evans, but
Right. Yeah.
again, I think it's so unlikely because just the fact that there's maybe 3 or 4 guys I could think of that I would say, "You know what? If it's gonna happen, it's gonna be one of them," tells me that it's so unlikely because there's those other if I pick one of them, there's those other 3 that are gonna pick one of those other races and do it solely, and then it's gonna be hard to beat. Or you get someone where I wouldn't bet on Zach Miller winning Western States. I wouldn't be
Mm.
shocked if he did, but he wouldn't be my first bet amongst the top guys, but I could very much bet him winning UTMB. So what
Mhm.
happens if Zach Miller peaks for UTMB while, say, Jim is trying to do the double or Killian's trying to do the double or Tom Evans trying to do the double, and here's Zach sitting in the background logging 50,000-foot vert climb weeks and getting ready just to like show up and destroy everyone on race day. But and then we just have the growth of the sport too, because it's like this year at UTMB, no one's betting on the men's winner before that race. So we also have the scenario where someone just pops up that we're not counting on yet, and they had been kind of grinding on that course specifically, and then they put up a day like we saw this year.
Yeah, Vincent's performance was amazing. I mean, like not expected. Like I don't recall people picking him to be the outright winner, and here he comes having the day of his life. Like that was just a really really cool thing to see. Yeah, and it's going to be interesting to see like if Jim takes another stab at it next year. But I agree. I think just the way that people race westerns so hard and then try to make that transition in is a tough thing too. But yeah, time will only tell.